On the third day of filming, Chuck Norris stepped onto the set an hour early. He wasn't smiling. Neither was Bruce. A silent crowd formed behind the lights. No camera rolled. No director called action. 8 seconds later, it was over. Chuck sat down alone. He didn't speak for the rest of the day. No one ever tried again. Cinecittà Studios stood just outside the edge of Rome's center, a maze of sound stages and rusted scaffolding touched by the sun. In 1972, it had already earned its nickname, Hollywood on the Tiber. But on that day, Soundstage 14 was quieter than usual. Way of the Dragon was Bruce Lee's first directorial project. It was meant to be a showcase, not only of martial arts, but of something else. Something unspoken. He did not tell people that part. He simply arrived early, walked the set alone, and watched everything. Bruce had no entourage. He didn't need one. His movements were composed, not slow, but never rushed. Each step seemed pre-decided, like he'd already walked the space hours before. The crew noticed. Lighting technicians stopped joking around. Even the catering staff kept their voices low. The Roman heat pressed through the studio walls, thick and still. Outside, tourists buzzed through the city. Inside, no one dared open a window. Chuck Norris was scheduled to arrive at 8:30 a.m. He was already in Rome for days, staying at a quiet hotel near Piazza Barberini. Bruce had invited him personally to play the final opponent in the film. The idea was novel. An American karate champion facing a Chinese martial artist in a gladiatorial showdown inside the Colosseum. It was meant to be symbolic. On paper, they were allies. On camera, competitors. But in the gaps between, there was something real forming. A test neither man admitted aloud. Chuck had never worked under Bruce's direction. In America, he was the name to beat. His tournament victories were still fresh. But here, on this foreign set, he was not the authority. Bruce was. And Bruce, as always, was quiet. That morning, Chuck arrived an hour early. A move Bruce would understand for what it was. The studio door opened without ceremony. He wore a plain t-shirt, loose pants, no trainers, just sandals. He didn't greet the crew. He looked directly toward Bruce across the floor, a long, polished stretch of matte canvas used for rehearsal. Bruce, already barefoot, acknowledged him with a glance. No nod, no smile, just presence. For a full minute, nothing moved. Crew members noticed. One by one, they stepped back from their tasks. Tape markers on the floor went untouched. Grip assistants leaned against their equipment. One cameraman, not filming, instinctively lifted his viewfinder, then lowered it again. There was no action to capture yet, only wait. In that moment, the set was no longer a film studio. It was something older, something colder. Not a stage, not yet a battleground. An arena. The kind where things were decided, not announced. And in that silence, both men understood. Something was going to happen. Not today. Not yet. But soon. Bruce turned away first, not to walk off, but to begin stretching. Slowly. Silently. Chuck remained standing. Watching. There is a particular kind of authority that doesn't need introduction. It does not demand a stage or even attention. It draws it. Bruce Lee embodied that kind of presence. On the set of Way of the Dragon, he was not merely the lead actor. He was the writer, the choreographer, the director. Every punch, every pause, every cut on the storyboard passed through him. Yet he gave no speeches. He didn't use a megaphone. His direction came through posture and precision. People followed not because they were told to, but because they feared missing something. Chuck Norris arrived with his own kind of gravity. His reputation had grown in America, not through films, but through fighting. His record in karate tournaments was formidable. He was, by every measure, a technician of force. In the States, he walked into dojos and was greeted as a champion. But this was Rome, and this was Bruce's film. The two men had known each other before. Not closely. Not as friends. In 1967, Bruce had watched Chuck fight at the All-American Karate Open in Long Beach. He'd seen the raw skill, but more than that, he saw something waiting to be refined. When the idea for Way of the Dragon took shape, Bruce made a deliberate choice. Chuck would not just be cast, he would be challenged. Chuck accepted the role quickly, but there were conditions he didn't recognize at first. On set, Bruce offered no special treatment. There were no deference gestures, no casual debriefs over lunch. Chuck, despite his fame, was expected to train like everyone else. Long hours of rehearsals under heat, strict adherence to rhythm, attention not to flash, but to form. It rubbed him the wrong way. He didn't say it aloud, but others sensed it. He missed 2 early rehearsals for a key fight scene. Bruce didn't respond. He simply moved on, reshuffling the order of shoots without comment. There was no confrontation, just silence. The kind that begins to echo louder than words. Chuck returned the next day, early again, not to make amends, but to reclaim ground. The studio's rehearsal mat became their shared language. Bruce demonstrated moves, crisp, minimal, inviting Chuck to mirror them. Chuck did. But sometimes, just slightly, he adjusted the tempo, a half-beat faster, a shade harder, enough to test the edge but not cross it. Bruce noticed. He said nothing. He simply changed the rhythm again, slower now. More precise, so exact that any deviation stood out. It was a lesson, delivered without lecture. The crew felt it before they understood it. The choreography wasn't just rehearsal. It was calibration, not of movement, of respect. There was no argument, no overt challenge. But between steps and strikes, 2 philosophies collided. Chuck brought power. Bruce brought control. And between them stood a growing tension, not hostile, not dramatic, but dense. Like 2 storms circling without touch. Something had begun. No one could say when, but everyone knew it hadn't ended. There are moments in film production where time begins to behave differently, where the days stretch, but the space between people compresses. On the Way of the Dragon set, this began to happen slowly. It wasn't in the script. It wasn't in any single event. But people started speaking less. The air in Studio 14, once filled with the typical shuffle of lights and chatter of grips, had grown dense. Conversations were trimmed down to necessities. Even the film's Italian crew, known for their expressive warmth, began moving with restraint. Some of them didn't understand English, but they understood posture. And the postures were changing. Every eye drifted, eventually, to 2 figures. Bruce moved with that quiet certainty he always had. Even in stillness, there was intent in his frame. A sense that stillness itself was part of something calculated. He made small corrections to others on set, always with precision, never more than needed. A hand gesture, a slight nod, nothing wasted. Chuck was different. There was tension in the way he stretched. Not athletic tension, but something psychological, controlled but visibly so. The way he paced between takes, the way he glanced at the fight choreography notes, then set them down without comment. He followed directions technically. But there was a gap. One camera assistant later described it as a delay between movement and agreement. Bruce noticed, but he did not correct it. He let the silence do the work. When actors missed marks or timing, Bruce would step in directly, adjusting with calm and almost surgical clarity. But with Chuck, he withheld, not in negligence. In design, there was an unspoken understanding between men like them. Not everything needed confrontation. Sometimes, letting someone drift far enough from the rhythm was the clearest way to show how far they'd wandered. The crew began to pick up on this. Whispers started during breaks. "Did you see the last rehearsal? Chuck's offbeat." Bruce didn't say anything. That's not like him. He's waiting. Waiting. It became the word people started repeating behind equipment carts and during smoke breaks outside the studio. They weren't waiting for a fight. Not exactly. No one expected a public brawl or outburst. That wasn't Bruce's way. And Chuck, for all his power, wasn't reckless. But the weight was there, like a glass of water filled just beyond the edge, not spilling but impossible to ignore. A lighting assistant began marking how many takes Chuck needed per scene. The numbers crept upward. Bruce never commented. But he began changing the camera angles, framing things tighter, more intimately, removing space, drawing attention. It wasn't punishment. It was a mirror, a reminder. Precision lives in restraint, and restraint, when held long enough, becomes pressure. That pressure began to shape the set itself. Choreography rehearsals were watched more closely. Even extras stood straighter. Sound technicians ran checks twice. No one wanted to be the cause of another delay. Not because they feared Bruce's anger. Because they feared his silence. Chuck, too, felt it. And one morning, without telling anyone, he began arriving before the call sheet time, alone. He didn't speak much, but he watched. He watched Bruce walk the floor, watched him correct an actor's shoulder angle with a single tap, watched the way people listened. And for the first time, Chuck seemed to realize this was not just Bruce's film. It was his territory. It did not happen during a scheduled rehearsal. There was no announcement, no build-up, no circle of anticipation. It happened between tasks, in the narrow space where people assume nothing important will occur. The cameras were idle. The crew was resetting lights for a later scene. Most eyes were down, focused on cables and marks on the floor. Bruce stood near the edge of the mat, reviewing a sequence in his head, arms loose at his sides. Chuck was a few steps away, finishing a stretch. No one can say who moved first. That detail changes depending on who tells the story. What does not change is the stillness that came just before it, a silence sharper than the ones that had come before. Chuck stepped forward, not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough to close distance. Bruce turned. There were no words exchanged, no signal to stop, no challenge spoken aloud. In any other setting, it might have looked like two men adjusting position, but the space between them collapsed. Chuck initiated with what he knew best, a fast, committed strike meant to test reaction time. Clean, controlled, nothing reckless, the kind of movement that had ended matches before they properly began. Bruce didn't retreat. He shifted. It was not a block, not a counter in the traditional sense. It was a redirection, a minimal change in angle that robbed the strike of its center. Chuck's balance adjusted instinctively, but by then the exchange had already moved beyond him. Bruce stepped inside. Once. There was no flurry, no combination, no dramatic finish. Just a single, decisive adjustment. Weight placement, timing, leverage. Chuck froze, not because he was hurt, because he understood. 8 seconds, perhaps fewer. Bruce disengaged immediately. He did not hold position, did not look around. He stepped back, returned to where he had been standing, and resumed his review, as if nothing had occurred. The room did not move. Someone dropped a clipboard. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Chuck stood still for a moment longer. Then he nodded, not to Bruce, but to himself. He walked to the side of the studio and sat down on a wooden crate. He did not rejoin rehearsal. He did not speak to anyone. No one asked him to. Bruce never addressed what happened. He did not explain, did not correct, did not claim authority. He simply continued directing. But something fundamental had shifted. The crew worked differently after that. Movements became tighter, rehearsals cleaner. There was less wasted motion, less noise. People watched Bruce not with curiosity now, but with clarity. As for Chuck, he remained seated for the rest of the morning. When he mentioned something later, it was not the technique, not the speed, it was the economy. How little he needed, one witness remembered him saying quietly days later. The exchange was never filmed. No footage exists, and yet decades on, those 8 seconds are remembered more vividly than scenes that took weeks to shoot. Because what happened wasn't performance. It was demonstration. The rest of that day unfolded without comment. There was no mention of what had happened, no post-mortem, no acknowledgement in the director's notes. Bruce continued with his work, moving through camera angles and scene planning with the same composed rhythm as always. Chuck remained present, but quieter. The wooden crate where he had sat during the silent exchange became his place for the rest of the day. He didn't leave the set. He didn't sulk. He simply observed, not out of defeat, but reorientation. Witnesses later said Chuck looked different. Not shaken, but thoughtful. Like someone reviewing every assumption he had brought with him, frame by frame, like a man discovering that he had not seen the full scale of the room he had walked into. Bruce never looked at him again that day, not as avoidance, but because he no longer needed to. From that moment forward, Chuck's behavior shifted, almost imperceptibly at first. He began practicing earlier, alone, not for show. His movements grew tighter, less theatrical. He stopped modifying the rehearsal choreography. He followed Bruce's direction precisely. The extra half-beat he had once added was gone. The crew noticed. And they adjusted too. There was a scene 2 days later, not a fight, but a moment of quiet dialogue near the Coliseum. Bruce called for a single take. It was rare. Normally, multiple angles were shot. But this time he simply said, "We've got it." The camera operator paused, expecting further instruction. Bruce raised a hand and moved on. Nothing more was said. It became clear that the atmosphere of the set had been altered, not by confrontation, but by calibration. No one was afraid. But everyone was alert. Actors rehearsed longer than needed. Costume staff began checking fabric alignment with greater precision. One of the electricians adjusted a light grid 6 times before the first shot. Not because it was broken, but because it could be better. Bruce's presence didn't demand excellence. It made mediocrity feel disrespectful. Chuck, for his part, never asked to reshoot anything. He became methodical, disciplined. He spent long hours watching Bruce choreograph background fighters. He took notes, though no one asked him to, and Bruce still said nothing, but he watched. That was enough. One day, during a break in shooting, Chuck approached a young stunt performer who had been struggling to keep rhythm in a group sequence. He didn't criticize. He demonstrated twice. Slowly, the stuntman followed. The scene was never reshot again. No one ever asked Bruce why he hadn't intervened himself. Some said he didn't need to. Others said it had been the point all along. Chuck had not been humiliated. He had been shown something deeper than technique, a way of being. Years later, when asked about Bruce, Chuck never told that story in detail, but he would pause before answering. And his answer was always the same. He taught without teaching. Rome moved on, as it always does. The film wrapped. The crew dispersed. The studio lights dimmed, and the set was struck. To most, it was just another production completed. But among those who had been there, those who had stood in that quiet space when nothing was said but everything shifted, something lingered. The story never made headlines. No one spoke of a challenge. No one needed to. Because the truth of what happened on that set was never about spectacle. It was about transmission, the silent passing of understanding from one master to another. Not through domination, but through example. Way of the Dragon would go on to become one of Bruce Lee's most iconic films. Audiences would cheer at the climactic Coliseum fight, a cinematic duel between Bruce and Chuck, choreographed to perfection. But the real lesson was not on screen. It had already taken place, days earlier, in silence. Years passed. Bruce Lee died in 1973, just 1 year after the Rome shoot. His death was sudden and the world mourned. Books were written, tributes poured in. But the people who had truly seen him, not the image but the man, remembered something quieter. Chuck Norris became a household name in the decades that followed. Films, television, fame. Yet when asked about Bruce, his tone always softened. Not with grief, but with recognition. "He was the best I ever faced," Chuck once said in an interview. But he wasn't speaking of combat. He was speaking of something else. A presence. A philosophy made visible. A man who never needed to impose his will to make it known. In dojos around the world, instructors told the story, not of a fight, but of a moment. A moment when one man revealed the depth of his control, not by overpowering another, but by doing almost nothing at all. That story evolved, as stories do. Some said Bruce intercepted a strike with perfect timing. Others said he simply moved and Chuck stopped himself. The truth didn't change. Because the point was never what he did. It was how little he needed to do. Younger martial artists heard the tale and expected drama. They asked, did they really fight? Who won? But the ones who had been there, or who had studied enough to know, answered differently. They didn't need to fight, they said. Chuck learned what he came to learn. And Bruce, he never needed to say it. In the years that followed, the legend grew, not in volume, but in weight. Quiet, consistent, undeniable, like a pressure system under the surface of calm water. To this day, when students of martial arts speak of mastery, they don't always mention belts or titles. They speak of moments, of presence, of restraint. They speak of that time in Rome, on a closed set, where two men stood alone under the lights, and only one of them moved. 8 seconds. No film. No sound. Just silence and understanding.